The shuttle docked with a low hum that vibrated through the floor and up into Kira Vasquez's boots, and she stood still for a moment, just breathing, and letting the recycled air of Valanthar Prime fill her lungs for the first time. It smelled like nothing and everything at once, metal and ozone, and a faint sweetness she could not name. And somewhere beneath all of that, the unmistakable staleness of a place that had never known wind or rain, or the heavy green smell of earth after a storm. She picked up her single regulation bag and stepped through the airlock into the wide, gleaming corridor of the Galactic Union Joint Military Academy. And the moment she crossed the threshold, she felt every pair of eyes in the reception hall turn toward her. There were dozens of species gathered there, tall insectoids with shimmering wings folded against their backs, and squat rock-skinned beings who barely came up to her hip, and slender furred creatures with 4 arms, who whispered to each other in frequencies she could almost hear, and all of them, without exception, stopped what they were doing and looked at the human. Kira smiled. It was a good smile, warm and open and completely rehearsed, and she had practiced it in front of a mirror for 3 weeks before leaving Earth, because the Terran Diplomatic Corps had told her that her natural resting expression, quote, made several test species experience involuntary fear responses, end quote. So she smiled, and she kept smiling as she walked through the hall, and she pretended not to notice the way bodies shifted away from her path, like water parting around a stone. A young officer at the registration desk, a pale blue amphibian with enormous dark eyes, actually flinched when Kira set her bag down on the counter. "Cadet Vasquez," Kira said gently, keeping her voice low and soft. "Reporting for orientation." The officer checked her datapad 3 times before confirming the assignment. Understood, because she was only the 3rd human ever admitted to the academy, and the first 2 had graduated quietly and without incident, and the Terran government wanted very badly for that pattern to continue. Her room was on Deck 14 in the mixed-species residential wing, and when the door slid open, she found her roommate already inside. Lyra Fendai was a Kel, barely 4 feet tall, with smooth amphibian skin that shifted between pale green and soft blue, depending on her mood, and right now it was cycling rapidly through shades of gray, which Kira's cultural briefing had told her meant intense anxiety. The little alien was pressed against the far wall of the room, holding a pillow in front of her body like a shield, and her huge bioluminescent eyes were locked on Kira, with the kind of frozen attention that prey animals gave to predators. Kira set her bag down very slowly and crouched to make herself smaller. "Hi," she said. "I am Kira, and I think we are going to be roommates, and I want you to know that I am really happy to meet you." Lyra said nothing, and her skin flickered to a darker gray. "I read that Kel prefer cooler temperatures," Kira continued in that same gentle tone. "So please set the room however you like, and I brought extra blankets for myself, so do not worry about me at all." It took 3 days for Lyra to speak more than 2 words to her, and it took 5 days for Lyra to stop sleeping with one eye open, and it took 8 days and 1 bar of earth-dark chocolate for Lyra to finally sit next to Kira in the mess hall without trembling. "This is incredible," Lyra whispered as the chocolate melted on her tongue, and her skin flushed a warm, happy gold that Kira had never seen before. "What is this substance?" "Chocolate," Kira said. "It comes from a plant on my world, and I brought 12 bars so we can make them last." They did not last, and Kira quietly ordered more through the station supply network. Never mentioned the cost. The first group training exercise came at the end of the 2nd week, and that was where Kira met Torvin Relk. He was impossible to miss. 7 feet of scaled muscle, wrapped in the kind of casual arrogance that only came from a lifetime of never being told no. And his family crest was emblazoned on his training gear, which was technically against regulation, but nobody was going to tell a Svalian aristocrat to remove it, because his father sat on the Union Council, and the Svalian bloc funded nearly half the Academy's operating budget. Torvin looked at Kira the way someone might look at an insect that had crawled onto a dinner plate. "So this is the Deathworlder," he said loudly enough for the entire training group to hear, and his voice carried the particular tone of someone who was performing for an audience. "I expected something more impressive, and instead they send us what? A small soft thing with no claws and no scales and no venom." Few of his friends laughed, and Kira noticed that most of the other cadets looked uncomfortable, but none of them spoke up. "Tell me, human," Torvin continued, stepping closer and towering over her. "On your world, do they teach you to stand upright, or is that something you learned just for us?" Kira looked up at him, and her smile never wavered, and her heartbeat, which she had trained herself to monitor, stayed perfectly steady at 62 beats per minute. "It is nice to meet you, Cadet Relk," she said. "I look forward to training together." She walked away, and she heard more laughter behind her, and she kept walking. That night, Lyra sat on her bunk with her skin cycling through angry shades of orange and red. "Why did you not say something?" Lyra demanded. "He was horrible to you, and you just smiled and walked away like it was nothing." Kira was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was different. Not the rehearsed diplomatic softness, but something quieter and more honest, and somehow much heavier. "I am not here for me, Lyra," she said. "Every human who comes to this academy after me will be judged by what I do here. And if I fight back, I am the aggressive Deathworlder who cannot control herself. And if I make a scene, then humans are dangerous and emotional, and they should never have been admitted." She paused and looked at her hands. Strong hands, scarred hands, hands that had done things the Terran Diplomatic Corps had specifically told her never to talk about. "I do not get to have bad days," she said. "I do not get to be angry, and I do not get to be hurt. And I carry this so that the next human who walks through those doors does not have to." Lyra's skin settled into a deep, quiet blue, the quell color for sadness. "That is not fair," Lyra whispered. "No," Kira agreed. "It is not." Across the station in the officers' lounge, Torvin Relk was telling his friends about the encounter and laughing about how the human had cowered and retreated, and how all the stories about Deathworlders were obviously exaggerated nonsense. He mistook her silence for submission, and he mistook her smile for fear, and he mistook her retreat for weakness. He was wrong about all three, and one day soon, the Academy would learn exactly how wrong he was. The Academy's endurance course was designed to break cadets and sort them by species capability, and Kira had been assigned to the high-gravity track, which was meant for beings from worlds with at least 1.5 times standard gravity. She ran alongside Crothians, massive crustacean creatures who stood 8 feet tall and weighed 3 times what she did, and Dravine, who were built like armored wolves, and a handful of other heavy world species who looked at the small human in their group with open confusion. The course was 12 kilometers through shifting gravity zones and atmospheric variations, and obstacle sections that simulated hostile terrain. And the target completion time for the high-gravity track was 45 minutes. Kira finished in 31. She was barely breathing hard when she crossed the line, and she had to remind herself to hunch over and put her hands on her knees and pretend to be more winded than she was, because the Terran Diplomatic Corps had given her a very specific performance ceiling, and she was already pushing it. The Crothian, who finished second, came in at 38 minutes and collapsed on the ground with his shell plates heaving. Sergeant Drell stood at the finish line with his datapad and said nothing, but Kira saw his eyes, small and dark and buried in a face like a scarred boulder, track her with something that was not surprise, because surprise would mean he had not expected it, and Kira was beginning to suspect that Drell had expected exactly this. The weeks ground forward, and Kira maintained her careful balance, good enough to pass, and sharp enough to earn respect, but never so dominant that she became a threat in anyone's mind. In combat practicals, she pulled her strikes, and she let slower opponents tag her, and she performed at precisely the level the diplomatic corps had authorized, top 20%, but never top 5. In the classroom, she was genuinely brilliant. Harder to hide, because tactics and strategy came to her like breathing, and she could read a battlefield map the way other people read children's books. But she learned to ask questions instead of giving answers, and to let others reach conclusions she had already found. Lyra watched all of this with growing frustration. "You are holding back," Lyra said one evening while they studied together in their quarters. "In the sparring ring today, you let that Pallion hit you, and I know you saw it coming, because your weight was already shifting before he even moved." Kira looked up from her datapad and smiled that diplomatic smile. "I am performing at my expected level," she said. "You are lying," Lyra said, and her skin turned the sharp violet of Kel indignation. "You are lying to everyone, and I think you are starting to lie to yourself." Kira did not answer that. Torvin Relk had not stopped, and in truth he had gotten worse, because Kira's refusal to react became a challenge to him, a puzzle he needed to solve, and an itch he needed to scratch. He knocked her food tray from her hands in the mess hall, and when she knelt to clean it up, he told his friends loudly that this was the natural position for a Deathworld animal, and several cadets looked away in discomfort, but nobody intervened. He had her excluded from study groups he controlled, which covered nearly half the tactical curriculum, and Kira had to learn that material alone in the library at night while other cadets slept. He invented a nickname for her, the Pet, and it spread through his circle and then beyond, and Kira heard cadets she had never met use it in the corridors, and she smiled and kept walking every single time. But it was what he did to Lyra that nearly broke the pattern. Kira came back to their quarters one evening to find Lyra sitting on her bunk, with her skin a terrible ashen white, the quell color of pure fear, and her small hands shaking so badly she could not hold her datapad. "What happened?" Kira said, and something in her voice made Lyra look up sharply, because it was not the diplomatic voice, and it was not the gentle voice, and it was something Lyra had never heard before. "Torvin," Lyra whispered. "He found me alone in the library corridor, and he told me that if I continued to associate with you, he would make sure I was reassigned to sanitation detail on a mining station. And he said his father could do it, and I believe him, Kira, because I think his father really could." Kira sat down next to her roommate and put an arm around the small, trembling body, and she held her, and her face was perfectly calm and perfectly still. But under the table, where Lyra could not see her, other hand was gripping the edge of the bunk frame, and the metal was bending under her fingers. "I will handle this," Kira said softly. She filed a formal report through the proper channels, and she documented every incident she could remember with dates and times and witnesses, and she submitted it to Commandant Yeshraval's office, and she waited. The Commandant called both of them in, and the meeting lasted 11 minutes, and Torvin received a verbal warning and a note in his file. And his father's diplomatic liaison sent a message within the hour expressing disappointment at the frivolous complaint. Kira walked out of the Commandant's office with the same smile she always wore, and she thanked the Commandant for her time, and she returned to her quarters and closed the door and sat on her bunk, and did not move for 3 hours. Lyra found her there in exactly the same position, and Kira's hands were folded in her lap, and they were shaking, not from fear, but from the sustained effort of keeping them still. "Are you all right?" Lyra asked. "I am fine," Kira said, and her voice was the diplomatic voice again, smooth and controlled, and utterly hollow. It was 2 days after that when Sergeant Drell pulled her aside. The old Crothian waited until the other cadets had filed out of the training hall, and then he sealed the door and turned to face Kira. And for a long moment, he just looked at her, with those small dark eyes. "I served with humans on Rethus 4, he said, and his voice was like gravel sliding over stone. 3 of them, and me, and 48 hours behind enemy lines, and I watched a human woman half my size carry my bleeding body 4 kilometers through a jungle that was actively trying to eat us." Kira said nothing. "I know what you are," Drell said, "and I know what you are doing, and I understand why, and I respect the discipline it takes more than you know." He paused, and his massive claws clicked together in what Kira recognized as a Crothian expression of concern. "But you cannot hold this forever," he said. "No one can, and no one should have to, and when it breaks, and it will break, I want you to know that there is at least one person on this station who will not blame you for being what your world made you." Kira looked at the old soldier, and for just a moment the mask slipped, and what Drell saw underneath was not rage and not pain, but something vast and patient and absolutely terrifying, the quiet of a predator so confident in its own lethality that it could afford to wait forever. Then the smile came back, and Kira thanked him and walked out, and Drell stood alone in the empty training hall and let out a slow breath. He had seen that look once before, on Rethus 4, right before the human woman who had saved his life walked into an enemy position alone, and came back 20 minutes later, covered in blood that was not hers. And when he had asked her what happened, she had smiled and said, "I handled it." Across the station, Torvin Relk was in his quarters, polishing his family crest and planning something bigger, because the verbal warning had meant nothing to him, and the humans' continued silence had convinced him completely that she was exactly what he believed her to be, a weak, frightened animal wearing a uniform she did not deserve. He was planning something public and something humiliating, and something that would prove once and for all that Deathworlders were not worthy of standing beside the civilized species of the galaxy. The annual Academy Sparring Tournament was the single most important competitive event on Velenthar Prime, and every cadet knew it, because tournament rankings affected career placement and unit assignments, and the trajectory of entire military lives. The main arena was a vast circular pit surrounded by tiered seating that could hold 3,000 spectators, and on tournament day, every seat was filled. Cadets and instructors and administrative staff and visiting dignitaries from half a dozen species blocks, including a Svalian diplomatic attaché named Grevin Relk, who happened to be Torvin's uncle, and who sat in the VIP section with the calm satisfaction of someone who already knew how the day would end. Kira had qualified for the mid-tier bracket, which was exactly where her carefully managed performance scores placed her. And she had won her first 2 matches with efficient, unremarkable technique. Good enough to advance, but nothing that would draw attention. Second and third rounds, there was a 30-minute break, and the arena buzzed with conversation and analysis. And Kira used the time to walk the service corridor behind the main hall, where it was quiet, and where she could breathe without performing for anyone. She was halfway down the corridor when Torvin stepped out from a side passage and blocked her path. He was not alone. 4 of his Svalian friends stood behind him, arranged in a loose semicircle that was casual enough to look unplanned, but tight enough to cut off retreat. And Kira noted all of this in the first half-second, the way she noted everything: exits and distances and angles and the weight distribution of every body in the space. "Going somewhere, pet?" Torvin said, and he was smiling with all of his teeth, which in a Svalian was a dominance display. Kira stopped and kept her hands relaxed at her sides. "Cadet Relk," she said evenly, "I need to get back to the arena for my next match." "Match," Torvin repeated, and he laughed and looked back at his friends who laughed with him. "Tell me, human, do you really think you belong in that arena with actual soldiers? Or do you know somewhere inside that soft little skull that you are only here because the Council felt sorry for your species?" "Please let me pass," Kira said. "Please let me pass," Torvin said, and he took a step closer, and he was so much taller than her that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. For weeks, I have watched you shuffle through this academy, with your pathetic smile and your fake politeness, and I have figured out what you are. He leaned down until his face was level with hers, and his breath was hot and sharp, with the chemical tang of Svalian metabolism. You are nothing, he said. Your species is nothing, and your world is a rock full of poison and violence, and the only reason any of you are still alive is because the galaxy has not bothered to step on you. Yet, Kira stood perfectly still, and her heartbeat was 60 beats per minute, and her breathing was slow and even, and her hands hung at her sides like they were made of stone. "Are you finished?" she said quietly. Something flashed in Torvin's eyes, frustration maybe, or the particular rage that comes from failing to provoke a reaction. And what happened next happened fast. He hit her. It was an open palm strike across the left side of her face, delivered with the full casual force of a 7-foot reptilian aristocrat who had never in his life faced a consequence for anything, and the sound it made was sharp and loud in the empty corridor. And his friends went quiet. Kira's head turned slightly with the impact. Not much, because her neck was strong in ways that Torvin's sheltered biology could not begin to comprehend. And for a single frozen moment, nobody moved. Then Kira turned her head back to face him. She did not stagger, and she did not stumble. She did not raise her hands to her face, and she did not make a sound. And she looked up at Torvin Relk, with eyes that held absolutely nothing in them. No anger, and no fear, and no pain. Just a stillness so complete and so deep that it was like looking into a well that had no bottom. Torvin's smile died. He had hit dozens of beings in his life, smaller cadets and servants, and anyone who displeased him. And every single one of them had reacted with pain, or fear, or submission, because that was what happened when a dominant predator struck a lesser creature, and the response was as reliable as gravity. But the human was not reacting, and the human was not afraid, and something in the ancient lizard part of Torvin's brain, something older than thought and older than language, began to scream at him that he had made a terrible mistake. Kira looked at him, and the corridor was silent, and even Torvin's friends had stopped breathing, and for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Nothing existed except the space between the human's eyes and his. Then Kira spoke, and her voice was so quiet that everyone had to lean in to hear it. "You get that one for free." She stepped around him, and he did not stop her, not because he chose to let her go, but because his body would not obey him, and his muscles had locked in place the way a prey animal freezes when it suddenly realizes that the shadow overhead is not a cloud. Kira walked down the corridor and around the corner, and she was gone, and Torvin stood there with his hands still tingling, and his heart's beating too fast, and one of his friends said something that he did not hear, because the only thing in his mind was the memory of those eyes, flat and empty and patient, like something that had been killing since before his species learned to walk upright. Kira did not go back to the arena. She went to the medical bay, and she walked in and sat down and told the attending physician, a nervous, 4-armed tesserae, that she needed to document a facial contusion resulting from an assault by another cadet. The physician scanned her face and recorded the bruise that was already forming, and logged the report. Kira signed the documentation and thanked her and left. She went back to her quarters, and the door closed behind her, and Lyra was not there, because Lyra was at the tournament, watching from the stands, and Kira was alone. She sat down on her bunk, and she pulled a small coin from her pocket, an old earth quarter that her mother had given her before she left, and she began to roll it across her knuckles, back and forth, in a slow, steady rhythm that she had learned years ago, in a jungle on a continent that most humans avoided. The coin moved, and her hands were perfectly steady, and her face was perfectly calm, and her breathing was perfectly even, and to anyone watching, she would have looked like a person in complete control. But if anyone had looked closely, really closely, they would have seen that the muscles in her jaw were clenched so tight that the tendons stood out like cables, and that her pupils were dilated to the point where her brown eyes looked almost black, and that the coin was moving not because she was calm, but because if her hands were not doing something, they would be doing something else. The door opened, and Lyra came in fast with her skin blazing orange. "I heard what happened," Lyra said. "3 cadets are talking about it. And Kira, are you?" "I just need a minute," Kira said, and her voice was the diplomatic voice, perfect and smooth and controlled. But Lyra had lived with this human for weeks now, and she heard what was underneath it, and for the first time since she had stopped being afraid of Kira Vasquez, she felt afraid of her again. Not afraid that Kira would hurt her, never that, but afraid the way you feel when you are standing next to something vast and powerful that is holding itself in check by the thinnest thread you have ever seen. Lyra sat down on her own bunk across the room, and she said nothing, and she watched the coin move back and forth across Kira's knuckles, and she waited. 3 decks away, Sergeant Drell sat in his quarters, reviewing the medical filing that had just appeared in the system, and he read it once, and then he read it again. And then he closed it and opened a different file, a restricted personnel file with Terran military classification codes that he should not have been able to access, but that someone in Terran intelligence had quietly made available to him years ago as a professional courtesy. He read through it slowly, the combat deployments on 3 different worlds, and the survival assessment on Crava 7, which was a Class 14 moon where she had been stranded alone for 19 days. And the hand-to-hand combat qualifications that were listed in a rating system the Academy did not even use, because the numbers would have been meaningless to anyone who had not seen a human fight. He closed the file and leaned back in his chair, and his massive claws tapped a slow rhythm on the desk. "That boy," he said to the empty room, "has absolutely no idea what he has done." The formal complaint landed on Commandant Yeshroval's desk at exactly 1400 hours station time, and by 1406, the first communication from the Svalian diplomatic attaché had already arrived, demanding that the matter be dismissed as a cultural misunderstanding. The commandant read both documents, with her compound eyes moving in slow, methodical patterns across the text. And she set them down, and folded 4 of her 6 limbs together in the insectoid posture of deep contemplation, and she said nothing for a very long time. Kira's complaint was clean and precise and devastating. Dates and incident numbers and witness names and medical documentation with biometric scans showing the exact force of the impact, and a complete timeline of harassment stretching back to her first week at the Academy. It was the kind of complaint that could not be ignored, and that was exactly the problem, because ignoring it would have been so much easier. Torvin Relk was doing what Torvin Relk always did when faced with an uncomfortable situation. He was rewriting it. "You should have seen her face," he told his circle of admirers in the common room. "She almost cried, and she could not even look at me, and I barely touched her. But these Deathworlders are all the same. Big reputation and no substance." He laughed, and his friends laughed, and the story grew with each telling, until by the end of the day, Torvin's version had Kira begging him to stop and backing away in tears. And he believed his own version, because he had spent his entire life believing whatever made him feel powerful. But the cadets who had actually been in that corridor told a different story. A Crothian upperclassman named Voss, who stood 8 feet tall and had fought in 2 border conflicts, sat in the mess hall with a group of cadets who asked him what had really happened, and he was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "I was not there," Voss said. "I spoke to Dinar, who was, and Dinar has not lied about anything in the 4 years I have known him, and what Dinar told me is this: the Svalian hit the human full force across the face, and the human did not move. He paused and let that settle. She did not flinch, and she did not step back, and she did not raise her hands, and she looked at him, and she said 5 words, and then she walked away. And Dinar said that every single person in that corridor, including Torvin's own friends, looked like they had just watched something they did not understand. Voss leaned forward, and his armored plates shifted with the movement. "That was not fear," he said. "I have seen fear in every species I have ever fought beside, and I have seen prey freeze, and I have seen soldiers break, and that was none of those things. That was something else entirely, and what it was is that she chose not to destroy him. And if you cannot see the difference, then you have never been close to something, truly." The mess hall was very quiet after that. Lyra Fendai had been afraid for most of her life, afraid of loud noises and large species and confrontation, and the vast, indifferent darkness of space. But something had changed in her over the past weeks, and the thing that had changed her was watching Kira absorb punishment after punishment, with grace and patience and an iron will that seemed to have no bottom. And now Lyra was angry. She was small and she was soft, and she had no claws and no venom and no armor. But she had something that Torvin Relk would never have. She had the courage of someone who had learned bravery from watching it practiced every single day. She started quietly, talking to cadets one by one in private, and asking them about their experiences with Torvin and his circle. And what she found was a deep well of grievance that had been sealed shut by fear. A Palian cadet who had been humiliated in front of his entire class and told no. 1. Lyra listened and documented it, and a Tesserae engineer whose research project had been sabotaged, and who had been too afraid of political retaliation to report it. Lyra recorded her testimony, and a dozen other cadets from a dozen other species, who had swallowed their dignity because Torvin's family name made him untouchable. Lyra gathered it all, and organized it, and filed a formal petition to the Academy Ethics Board with 17 signatures. And she did it with her skin cycling through every shade of terrified violet, but she did it anyway. The disciplinary hearing was held in the Academy's formal chamber, a circular room with high ceilings and cold lighting designed to make everyone in it feel small, and the seating was arranged so that the accused faced the board directly, with nowhere to hide. Torvin sat in the respondent's chair, with his uncle, the diplomatic attaché, seated behind him in the observer section. And he looked bored, because this was a process he had been through before. In various forms, and it had never resulted in anything meaningful. Commandant Vol presided, and the first hour was procedural, reading of charges, and presentation of evidence, and formal statements from both parties, and Torvin's advocate argued that the incident was a minor physical altercation between cadets, and that the human's complaint was disproportionate. Then Sergeant Drell was called to present supplementary evidence, and the room shifted. Drell walked to the center of the chamber, carrying a datapad, and he did not look at Torvin, and he did not look at the diplomatic attaché, and he addressed the commandant directly. During the course of standard training assessment, Drell said, "I reviewed Cadet Vasquez's biometric performance data, as recorded by the Academy's passive sensor network, and I found significant discrepancies between her demonstrated performance and her actual capability." He activated a holographic display, and 2 sets of numbers appeared side by side. On the left, Drell said, are Cadet Vasquez's official training scores, consistently in the top 20% of her tier. And on the right are her actual physiological readings, as captured by embedded sensors during every training session she has participated in. The room went very still. The numbers on the right were not 20% above average, and they were not 50% above average. They were in a category that the Academy's scoring system did not have a name for because it had never needed one. Reaction times faster than any species on record, striking force that exceeded the heavy gravity class maximum, and endurance metrics that the display had to rescale twice to fit on the screen. Cadet Vasquez has been deliberately underperforming, Drell said, for the entire duration of her enrollment, and the degree to which she has suppressed her actual capabilities suggests that at any point during the incidents described in this complaint, she possessed the physical ability to cause catastrophic harm to Cadet Relk. He paused. She chose not to. The silence in the room was absolute, and even the diplomatic attaché had stopped his quiet conversation with his aide. The commandant turned to Kira. "Cadet Vasquez," Vol said, "you have heard the evidence presented, and I will ask you directly, why did you not defend yourself?" Kira stood, and she was the smallest person in the room by a significant margin, and she looked at the commandant with steady eyes. "Because I was ordered to be an ambassador," Kira said, and her voice was clear and calm. "Because I was told that the future of human integration into the galactic community depended on me being safe and being quiet and being less than what I am." She paused, and the room waited. "I followed every rule," she said. "I filed every report, and I smiled through every insult, and I made myself small so that no one would be afraid of me. And I did everything right, and he hit me anyway." Torvin looked at his hands, and for the first time, he did not look bored. The ruling came after 40 minutes of deliberation. Torvin was found guilty of conduct violations and harassment and assault, and he was suspended from the tournament and given a formal reprimand that would follow him through his career, and assigned mandatory behavioral counseling. His uncle protested, and Commandant Vol looked at the diplomatic attaché with all 6 of her eyes and said, "The ruling stands." But it was the final item that changed everything. "Regarding Cadet Vasquez," the Commandant said, "the Academy hereby rescinds all externally imposed performance limitations, and Cadet Vasquez is ordered to train and perform at her full and actual capability, effective immediately." Kira blinked, and for just a moment the mask cracked, and something raw and overwhelmed flickered across her face before she controlled it. "Commandant," she said. That night, long after the station had cycled to its dim sleep lighting, Kira went to the training hall alone. The room was empty and dark, and she activated a single overhead light that illuminated the center of the floor, where a reinforced striking dummy stood, the heavy model, rated for Crothian-class impacts, and anchored to the floor with industrial bolts. Kira stood in front of it, and she breathed in, and she breathed out, and she let go of every restraint she had since the day she arrived. Every pulled punch, and every swallowed response, and every moment of making herself less. She hit the dummy once. The impact was a sound like nothing the training hall had ever recorded. A deep concussive crack that echoed off the walls, and the dummy's sensor panel lit up, and the number it displayed was so far beyond the previous Academy record that the system flagged it as a malfunction and recalibrated and measured again. Malfunction. Kira looked at her fist and flexed her fingers, and there was no pain, because her bones were dense, and her tendons were strong, and her body had been forged on a world that killed anything that was not built to last. She smiled, and it was not the diplomatic smile. It was older and wider, and it showed her teeth, and there was something in it that was wild and free and purely absolutely human. The tournament bracket was recalculated overnight, and when the new rankings were posted on the Academy's central display the next morning, a crowd gathered around it in silence and stared. Kira Vasquez had been moved from the mid-tier bracket to the unrestricted championship tier, the division reserved for the most dangerous combat-capable cadets in the entire Academy. And her revised performance scores were listed beside her name in numbers that most of the gathered cadets had to read 3 times to believe. A Tesserae engineer standing near the back of the crowd pulled up a comparison chart on her datapad and showed it to the cadet beside her. "These numbers are higher than any graduate in the last 40 years, the Tesserae whispered. "She has been here for weeks, and she was hiding this the entire time." The first match was scheduled for 1000 hours, and the arena was full before 9, because word had spread through the station like fire through dry atmosphere. And everyone wanted to see what the human could do when she was not pretending to be something less. Kira walked into the arena wearing standard academy training gear, with no family crest and no embellishments. And she looked exactly the same as she always had, small and calm and unremarkable. And if you did not know what you were looking at, you might have thought she had been placed in the wrong bracket. Her first opponent was a Garathi, a six-limbed predator species from a high-gravity jungle world, who stood 6.5 feet tall and moved with the fluid speed of something that hunted by ambush. And the Garathi looked at Kira with open confidence, because size and reach advantages were supposed to matter. The bell sounded, and Kira moved. It was not fast in the way that other species understood fast. It was fast in the way that a lightning strike was fast, where by the time you perceived it, the event was already over. And she closed the distance between them in a single, explosive step, and she was inside the Garathi's reach before his arms could react. And she struck once, to the nerve cluster beneath his primary shoulder joint, and he dropped. 7 seconds. The arena was silent for a full 3 heartbeats, and then it erupted. Kira helped the Garathi to his feet, and he looked at her with something between admiration and bewilderment. And she bowed to him in the Garathi style, which she had learned from a cultural database the night before. And he bowed back, and the crowd roared again. Her second match was against a Valori, one of the psionic species, who fought by reading their opponent's neural patterns and predicting movements before they happened. And the Valori were considered nearly unbeatable in single combat, because fighting someone who could read your mind was like fighting someone who had already seen the future. The Valori cadet settled into her trance state and reached out with her psychic awareness to map Kira's intentions. And what she found there made her hesitate. Human neural patterns were chaos, not the organized, structured thought patterns of galactic species who had evolved on stable worlds with predictable environments, but the wild, tangled storm of a brain that had been shaped by a planet where the weather could kill you, and the animals could kill you, and the plants could kill you, and even the water could kill you. A brain that had learned to process 100 threats simultaneously and react to all of them at once. The Valori could see what Kira was going to do, but she could see 17 things Kira was going to do, and all of them were real, and all of them were committed. And by the time she sorted the true intent from the noise, Kira had already moved. 22 seconds, and the Valori yielded with a gasp that was half frustration and half amazement. "Your mind is a thunderstorm," the Valori told Kira afterward. "How do you live in there?" Kira shrugged and said, "Get used to it." The third match was a Crothian, one of Voss's weight-class cadets who massed 3 times what Kira did, and whose armored shell could withstand ballistic impacts. And the crowd expected this to be the match that stopped her, because surely the human could not overcome raw mass and armor. Kira did not try to overpower him, because she was human, and humans did not survive by being the biggest or the strongest. They survived by being the most adaptable, and the most creative, and the most relentlessly persistent problem solvers their world had ever produced. She fought him like water fights rock, flowing around his strikes and targeting the gaps in his armor, and using his own momentum against him with techniques that the Academy's combat database could not even classify, because they were drawn from a dozen different Earth martial traditions that had been developed over thousands of years of humans fighting each other. 11 seconds, and the Crothian was on the ground. And Kira offered him her hand and pulled him up with a strength that surprised even him. Sergeant Drell watched from the instructor's platform, and his scarred face showed nothing, but his claws were clicking in the rapid pattern that meant deep satisfaction. Commandant Vol watched from the administrative box, and what she felt was more complicated: pride and unease, and the dawning awareness that the galaxy's understanding of humanity was about to change fundamentally and permanently. The final match of the championship round was against a Dravine named Kestra, a female from a Class 9 world which was the highest Deathworld rating for any non-human species. And Kestra was the reigning tournament champion, and she had held that title for 3 consecutive years. This was the match everyone had been waiting for, Deathworld against Deathworld. And when both fighters entered the arena, the energy in the room was electric and visceral, and even the most composed. Dignitaries leaned forward in their seats. Kestra was beautiful in the way that all apex predators were beautiful, sleek and powerful and covered in iridescent scales that shifted color with her mood. And she looked at Kira, not with contempt or fear, but with the deep recognition of one survivor meeting another. "I have wanted to fight a human since I was young," Kestra said. "My mother told me stories." "Good stories?" Kira asked. "Terrifying ones," Kestra said, and she smiled, and it was a predator's smile, and Kira smiled back, and hers was too. The bell sounded and they fought, and it was nothing like the previous matches. It was a conversation written in speed and violence and grace, 2 bodies shaped by worlds that tried to kill everything on them, moving at speeds the audience could barely follow, and every strike was met with a counter, and every feint was read and answered, and they pushed each other higher and faster and harder, until the air between them seemed to hum with energy. The match lasted 4 minutes and 27 seconds, which was longer than Kira's previous 3 matches combined. And when it ended with Kira pinning Kestra in a hold that the Dravine could not break. Not because she was stronger, but because she found an angle that Kestra's physiology could not counter. Kestra yielded, and Kira released her immediately and offered her hand. And Kestra took it and stood. And then she did something that no one expected. She pressed her forehead against Kira's in the Dravine warrior's salute that was reserved only for those considered true equals. The arena erupted into the loudest sustained ovation the Academy had heard in living memory. In the stands, Torvin Relk sat in the suspended cadet section, where he had been required to observe the tournament he was no longer permitted to compete in, and he watched all of it. He watched the human who he had called a pet dismantle 4 of the best fighters in the Academy without breaking a sweat, and he watched the faces of the cadets around him, the awe and the fear and the respect, and he understood finally what he had done. He had not hit a frightened animal. He had slapped a creature that could have torn him apart between one heartbeat and the next, a creature that had looked at him with those flat, patient eyes and decided that he was not worth the effort, and the mercy in that decision was so vast and so complete that it made his stomach turn. He did not know if this understanding would make him a better person, and the truth was that it might not, because some people learn from their mistakes, and some people simply learn to avoid the consequences. But either way, he left the arena quietly, and he did not speak to anyone, and the arrogance in his posture was a little less certain than it had been before. Lyra was in the front row, screaming at a volume that her small body should not have been capable of producing, and her skin was blazing gold, pure radiating joy. And when Kira came out of the arena, Lyra threw herself at the human and wrapped her small arms around her, and held on. "You were incredible," Lyra said. "You were absolutely incredible." "I could not have done any of this without you," Kira said, and she meant it, because Lyra's petition and Lyra's bravery and Lyra's stubborn, furious refusal to let injustice stand had been the thing that cracked the system open. "You taught me something," Lyra said, and she looked up at Kira with those huge, luminous eyes. "You taught me that being brave does not mean being unafraid. It means being afraid and choosing to act anyway." Kira hugged her tighter and did not let go for a long time. The political aftermath moved quickly, as political aftermaths always do when the ground shifts beneath established power. The Sphalian bloc quietly withdrew their formal opposition to expanded human enrollment, not because they had changed their beliefs about Deathworlders, but because publicly opposing humanity after the entire academy had watched a human dominate the championship tournament was a position that served no one's interests. Commandant Vol forwarded Kira's complete performance data to the Galactic Union Council with a single-line recommendation that read, "Expand human enrollment immediately." And within a week, 3 additional human cadets received acceptance notifications. Sergeant Drell found Kira in the corridor after the closing ceremony, and he looked at her for a long moment, and then he extended his massive claw in the human handshake gesture that he had learned years ago on Refus 4. "Well fought," he said. "Thank you, Sergeant," Kira said, "for everything." "Do not thank me," Drell said. "You did this yourself. You and that little quell who has more fight in her than beings 10 times her size." He paused. "Your world should be proud." That evening Kira sat alone in her quarters, with the viewport open to the stars, and her comm unit connected to Earth, and on the other end of the line was Commander Chen of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, who had been her handler since before she shipped out. "Outstanding work, Vasquez," Chen said. "The Council is very pleased, and your performance has accelerated the integration timeline by an estimated 3 years." "Thank you, sir." "One thing, though," Chen said, and his tone shifted to the careful diplomatic register that Kira knew so well. "Going forward, we would appreciate it if you could maintain a somewhat lower—" "With all due respect, sir," Kira said, and she was smiling, really smiling, the way she had not smiled since she left Earth. "I think the profile has changed." There was a pause on the line, and then Chen laughed, a real, genuine laugh, and said, "Yeah, I suppose it has." The call ended, and Kira sat in the quiet of her room, with the stars spread out before her, millions of them, cold and bright, and impossibly far away, and somewhere among them, invisible at this distance, was a small blue world that orbited an unremarkable yellow star. That world had given its children many gifts, strong bones and tireless hearts, and minds that burned with curiosity and stubbornness, and an absolutely insane refusal to stay down when knocked down. But the greatest gift it had given them was the hardest one of all. It had taught them when to hold back and when to let go. The galaxy had spent centuries looking at Earth's classification, Deathworld Class 12, and wondering what kind of monsters such a place could produce. And they had imagined claws and fangs and brute savagery, because that was what their experience told them danger looked like. They had never considered that the most dangerous thing a Deathworld could make was not a monster at all. It was a woman who could break you with one hand, and chose to offer that hand in friendship instead. Beginning to understand.